So now it is my honor to introduce Peter Manseau. Peter Manseau held off on going on his trip with his family just to speak today. So he made an amazing sacrifice for us to be here. He has a list of accomplishments, but what I want to point out is he's a frequent writer for the New York Times and the Washington Post. He holds a doctorate from the Georgetown University, and he is the curator of American religious history at the Smithsonian Institution. This is a very smart man and a very funny man, if you've ever read some of his work. This is a book that he will tell you about a little later on, but without further ado, Peter Manseau. Do you need this at all?
Thank you, Gavin. Gavin, Mayor Buckley probably oversold my my sense of humor, so don't be surprised if I'm not funny. He actually mentioned to me that one of the reasons he asked me is he wondered if there could be some moments of levity during this gun and violence summit, and I thought that's a tough ask, Gavin. But I am honored to be here today and to be part of this conversation about making our cities safer, and also to be part of the series of events remembering the brave journalists from the Capitol. I won't be here as part of the memorial services tomorrow. I'm actually leaving on my vacation tomorrow, so can't be here with all of you for that. And so I did want to begin just by noting that as I imagine it was for many people here, the shooting at the Capitol offices last year was very personal to me. Like most artists and writers here in Annapolis, I was often in touch with Wendy Winters. I'd send Wendy a note whenever I had a new book published, or whenever I was involved with an event I hoped that she might publicize, or really just to let her know about anything that was happening that she might be interested in. As anyone who knew Wendy can tell you, she was interested in a great many things. Wendy always responded to my out-of-the-blue emails, and she featured my own and my family's various projects in her column more than once. Many others I know could say the same thing. She offered us all in this community the opportunity to see that our local activities could appear in print alongside the news of the world. And in this way, she was a perfect representation of what a newspaper like the Capitol means to a city like Annapolis. A free and independent press is the best friend a free and independent people can have. Which is why Wendy's death, along with Rebecca Smith, Rob Hyacin, Gerald Fishman, and John McNamara a year ago tomorrow, was such a loss. It was a loss not only to the community, but it also felt like a loss of the community itself. Wendy was one of the ties that bound us all together. As we continue to work at repairing those bonds, it's not only appropriate, but really necessary to look for ways to understand and combat the kinds of senseless violence that ended her life. One way we must do so, which we don't do enough, is to consider that our current dilemma concerning the place of guns in our culture is part of a long history that is far more complex than we usually suppose. It's a history that dates back before the founding of this country, and it's bound up in the stories we tell about all that guns have helped to accomplish. From an early age, we are taught that guns tamed the wilderness. We're taught that guns won the nation's independence. We're taught that guns opened the West, gave the United States the current shape that it has. Yet forgotten in this well-known mythology, there are stories that paint a very different picture of what guns have meant to this country. Those are the kinds of stories that I've collected in my book, Melancholy Accidents. And my publisher has graciously donated many copies, so I welcome you all, if you're interested, to come up and take one and share it. I'll tell a few of those stories that are included in this book today, but first I wanted to say a word about how I found them. As Gavin mentioned, I'm not a historian of firearms or of the military or of law enforcement or of any of the subjects that might lend to an interest in the history of guns. I am actually a historian of religion in America specifically, and I'm the curator of American Religious History at the Smithsonian, where my job is to create programs and exhibitions about belief in all its variety across the United States at different moments through time. Yet, as I've come to discover, guns and faith are often entwined in narrative of the nation's history, and often not always in the ways we might expect. A few years ago, I was researching a book on the influence of minority religious traditions in America, a book called One Nation Under God's, which was published in 2015, and which Wendy Winters was kind enough to write about in her column, in fact. Researching that book, I spent my days combing through newspaper archives, looking for 18th and 19th century mentions of Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, Jews, and other small religious communities that have been part of American religion from the beginning. Yet as I scrolled through those long ago headlines, a certain type of story that had nothing to do with the subject I was researching began to catch my eye. Stories like this from the Boston Evening Post, September 19th, 1774. A melancholy accident happened at Roxbury on Monday last. 2 young men diverting themselves with military exercises. One of them gave the word of command to fire. The other instantly discharged his piece, not knowing it was loaded, and the ball entered the head of his companion, Mr. Henry Wilson, 22, and killed him on the spot. Or another story I found in the Pennsylvania Packet of April 25th, 1789. A melancholy accident happened on Monday last at White's Hotel. A seafaring lad who had been in the house a few weeks was in the kitchen with a servant girl, where a musket had laid for several months, and no person, from its being so foul and rusty, ever knew that it was loaded. The boy, in exercising the gun, placed it close to the girl's head, when it immediately went off, the contents of which were lodged in the poor creature's head. She instantly expired. Or another one from the newspaper The American in New York City, July 8th, 1831. Melancholy accident. As Nathaniel Ellicott was in the act of cocking and raising a gun, it unexpectedly discharged its load, the butt end giving him a violent blow in the bowels. The gun had been heavily loaded with nearly double the usual proportion per shot for the purpose of shooting on the wing. Medical assistance was immediately obtained, but proved to no avail. He lived 24 hours after the accident occurred in extreme suffering. Reading through thousands of pages of newspapers from the colonial period in the early republic, I was looking for discussions of belief, and frequently I found descriptions of mayhem instead. Those reports of accidental historical gun mishaps I stumbled upon first at random, but something about them so intrigued me that I began looking for more. Once I knew to search for that phrase common to all of them, melancholy accident, I found similar stories everywhere I looked. It turns out that inadvertent homicides, unintended suicides, and other firearm-induced injuries were so frequent in early America that a regular account of so-called melancholy accidents could be found in newspapers across the country. The stories often took the form of gem-like narratives that captured the damage done by stray bullets in excruciating detail. Here's one I found that occurred not far from here, on July 26, 1759. Last Thursday, near Annapolis, a very melancholy accident happened. A number of gentlemen were firing guns for entertainment. Mr. William Hamilton, merchant of Prince George's County, took hold of the muzzle to shake down a charge, but as he was lifting it up, it went off, and mangled and tore away a great part of his belly, so that his entrails fell out, and he expired in a few minutes. Another man was thereby knocked down, and he recovered. Mr. Hamilton was a gentleman justly esteemed, and his immature death is much regretted, having left a young widow near her time. Gruesome though they were, such reports were so popular that the tradition of publishing tales of death and dismemberment continued unchanged through the birth of the Republic and beyond. Reading such reports now, their clinical attention to injuries seems torn from the pages of hard-boiled detective novels. In the florid style of the day, a gunshot not only kills a man, but, quote, puts a period to his existence. Widows tend to be disconsolate. The children of the dead are without fail numerous. When one brother kills another brother during a hunting expedition, it must be noted that they had always lived in the greatest harmony together. Some of the melancholy accident reports are darkly humorous, like a short notice from 1874 that reads, "A Kansas boy earned a nice Bible by committing 300 verses to memory, and then he traded his Bible for a shotgun and accidentally shot his aunt in the leg. A fearful warning to all aunts." Other reports note with the unexpected frequency of people shot by their dogs. More often, these reports are devastatingly sad, such as the abundant accounts of parents accidentally killing their children. There's a short report from November 2nd, 1873, in which a man who had unintentionally shot his son, quote, slowly pined away from grief and remorse and died of a broken heart. The pain he must have felt is unimaginable. But moreover, it reminds us that the initial shot in every story of a gun death is really only the beginning. It echoes through all the lives around it. As a public historian, I'm always looking for moments of the past that might speak to today's concerns. I might have dismissed these reports merely as historical curiosities, but for the fact that I began noticing them about 5 years ago, around the same time when contemporary gun accidents were beginning to get much more attention. While I was collecting hundreds of stories like those I just mentioned from historical newspapers, I was also reading in current papers of a 9-year-old girl in Arizona who accidentally killed a shooting instructor while he was teaching her to use an Uzi submachine gun on a rifle range. I read reports showing that in the year following the deaths of 20 children at Sandy Hook Elementary School, more than 100 kids the same age had been accidentally shot and killed around this country. One of the most awful stories came just after Christmas in 2014, when a young woman in Idaho visited a Walmart supercenter with her 2-year-old son. As they made their way through the aisles, the toddler reached into his mother's purse, drew out a legally concealed 9mm Smith & Wesson handgun. He then fired at his mother from point-blank range, killing her instantly. Because this had occurred in a county with 100,000 people and 20,000 concealed gun permits, local law enforcement expressed sympathy but stopped short of questioning the logic of keeping a weapon where a toddler could reach it. A lieutenant at the sheriff's office said, "It's pretty common around here. A lot of people carry loaded guns." Comments from the dead woman's family likewise lent the shooting an air of unavoidability. They lived their lives around weapons, the mother's loved ones explained. They spent their free time at rifle clubs and on hunting trips, so blasts like those that rang through the supercenter on a Tuesday morning were not usually cause for alarm. They rang naturally through their days. As her father-in-law explained to the press, "We are gun people." For them, guns weren't merely tools of self-defense or sporting equipment or a hobby. They were part of their identity. Though it was just one of more than 12,000 gun deaths in America that year, something about this shooting in Idaho cried out for retelling across media and around the world. Dozens of news stories throughout the country hit the same sad notes, while the hashtag #IdahoWalmart lit up Facebook and Twitter. Reports in Europe highlighted Idaho state legislation that expanded areas where concealed weapons could be allowed. As far away as Australia, a correspondent ruefully observed, quote, "Normally when they handle a gun, very young children kill themselves or other children." Normally, as if that could ever be normal. What made this story so compelling? Was it the setting within the national ritual of a post-holiday shopping trip? Or perhaps it was the familiar image at its core, the distracted mother hunting for deals as a curious child digs through her purse. As the New York Times noted in its reporting on the woman's death, quote, "The details are shatteringly ordinary." In their very ordinariness, the facts of the shooting added up to something haunting. A sudden recognition that guns now move through the American landscape with such ubiquity that even a family stroll through Walmart can end with unimaginable tragedy. The story suggested that the question we collectively face is not if the guns all around us will fire, but when. It also revealed something about how we make sense of such sudden eruptions. In every aftermath, we become a nation of bystanders, gathering the information required to calibrate how shocked or how saddened we should feel. Unfortunately, it seems to be less every time. The hashtag Idaho Walmart was particularly ripe for spreading through social media. But by then I knew reports of these kinds of tragic gun mishaps were not a creation of the digital age. They were, in fact, a continuation of a long American tradition of melancholy accidents. This tradition lives on. If you have a spare moment today, take out your phones and Google accidental shooting. You might have to hit the news tab to get the most recent accounts. In just the last few days, you'll find in California, the headline says, San Bernardino boy, 12, dies after being accidentally shot by twin. In Florida, deputy wounded in foot during accidental shooting. In Texas, 3-year-old boy dies 2 days after accidentally shooting himself. In Mississippi, gun safety questions arise after 11-year-old dies in accidental shooting. In a country of more than 320 million people, and as noted, more than 300 million guns. Interesting footnote to that statistic, that number represents fully 46% of the civilian-owned guns in the world. It is a unique problem. It's a unique problem here. Given that landscape, a handful of such shootings every day does not amount to much, of course, except to those who are personally involved. Even when they reach into the thousands, as they do most years, unintentional shootings are statistically invisible when viewed against other causes of death. Yet the stories told of gun accidents echo far beyond each isolated shot. We often tell them as tales of misfortune and warning, recounted either as lamentations on the vagaries of fate or condemnations of carelessness. No matter the circumstances, we rarely talk about them the way we talk about other accidents, but as fables with lessons to impart, parables of a sort. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about gun accidents might be that they are still news at all. Guns are designed to do exactly one thing, and we remain shocked when they do it. Their capacity to do what they were made to do is a reliable source of surprise. Just as the phrase melancholy accident usually appears in these historical accounts, in current reporting, the word most often used to describe the conditions that lead to such mishaps is nearly always the same: somehow. Scanning through recent news items, you can read it repeated like a talking point or a mantra. In Utah, a man in charge of setting up targets on a shooting range somehow received a bullet intended for a bullseye. In Florida, a gun rights advocate was driving with her son when she heard a bang and felt a pain in her back. As one news item said, the small child was sitting in the vehicle's back seat right behind his mother and somehow got his hands on her handgun. In Michigan, an 11-year-old boy was killed when, quote, somehow he got hold of a gun and started playing with it. In Kentucky, the shooting of another boy was described as if there had been no shooter involved at all. The news said, while at a gathering with several other kids and adults, police say the 8-year-old was somehow shot. The list of somehow shootings could go on and on. We are, it seems, in the midst of a somehow epidemic, and we have been for a long time. In the past and today, the way we talk about the damage done by guns often gives it this air of the unavoidable. All those somehows subtly suggest there is no one responsible, that we are doomed to remain powerless before guns and fate. Like earthquakes or tornadoes, we often regard shootings now as acts of God, which we are helpless to prevent. Along with this dark sense of inevitability, the historic accidents reports I've collected have many other things in common with today's. The majority of gun accidents are family affairs. Fathers shoot daughters, mothers shoot sons, husbands shoot wives, and perhaps most frequently, in the historic accounts, brothers shoot sisters. Accounts of the latter often strike notes of sibling mischief gone awry. Younger brothers pointing rifles at older sisters, looking for a laugh. Then comes the shot, and the game is over. A shadow of abuse lingers over some of these tales, hints that not all accidents are equally accidental. In many cases, the narratives conclude with the sense that the family members of those killed or gravely wounded are left to contend with a grief that cannot be contained by a newspaper's column inches. Accident report writers scattered throughout the young United States were also drawn to the same themes. Many took a remarkably similar interest in trajectory, in the paths traveled by projectiles as they intersected with human lives. A writer in 1801 described a single shot that passed through a man's hand, then his wrist, then his shoulder. A writer in 1838 took care to note how a charge entered a boy's head on the left side, a little in front of the ear, before passing out the back of his head and continuing on its course. 17 years later, another report described a shot stitching through a crowd like a needle, drawing scraps of fabric together. On its way toward the woman it killed, it passed, quote, through the skirts of a young man's coat standing near, and then tore the dress of a lady who was standing behind. As tempting as it might be for gun control advocates to view the plague of stray bullets that afflicted our forebears simply as proof of how little our gun-obsessed culture has changed, it's not that simple. To begin with, as the exploding firearms and many historical accidents reports suggest, guns themselves are far more safe than they used to be. Yet the relative safety of modern firearms may now be part of the problem. A mother who keeps a gun in her purse as she shops with her children likely does so with the belief that it will go off only when and how and where she chooses. The improvement of machines designed to kill has not broken the continuity between the past and the present. It has only reinforced it by offering the false security of domesticating objects that will always remain half wild. Guns play roles in the American imagination. They have been used to evoke crime, liberty, the frontier, tradition, and most recently, stand your ground vigilantism. They are so embedded within our culture that it can be difficult to make even the most placid plans without speaking of aiming, or shooting, or hitting a target. But what if the ways guns are usually spoken of, in politics, in entertainment, in daily conversation, do not reflect their most durable meaning? Though to many they are markers of the virtues that make the nation unique, every gun also comes loaded with an alternate history, not heroic self-reliance, but hapless tragedy. One of the reasons widespread agreement on guns seems unlikely anytime soon is that they simply mean very different things to roughly equal portions of the population. After every mass shooting, two things seem to happen. A brief clamor rises for stricter gun control laws, and gun purchases spike. The interesting thing is that each of these reactions is born of the same desire to feel more safe. Advocates for increased gun control laws believe that laws will protect them. Gun rights activists believe that they must protect themselves. Pessimistically, I can't help but think that both these beliefs are delusions. The former because machines designed to kill are part of our culture in ways that can't be undone. The latter because despite claims that lives would have been saved if bullets had been flying in the other direction in Paris or San Bernardino or Pittsburgh or Charleston, more guns firing usually means more death, not less. If the gun debate is unable to change, it may be because, for both sides, it's perceived to be about maintaining some sense of control over a world that seems ever more dangerous. For both sides, it is ultimately a matter of belief about what that means. I collected these stories of gun accidents because they struck me as an untold part of our history, rather than with any specific political agenda in mind. Yet their overall significance is as a vivid reminder that despite our mythology, guns have far more often played a tragic role in individual American lives than a heroic one. As I mentioned, I began to collect gun accident reports while researching religion in America, so the two are inevitably connected for me. But they, I think, are more broadly connected as well. We can hear this in one of the most common responses to mass shootings today. In the immediate aftermath of such events, many public figures are quick to suggest that they, of course, should not be politicized while offering thoughts and prayers. What I'd like to suggest to you today is that if more thought was given to guns, maybe we would need fewer prayers in the aftermath of their use. If more thought was given to our fraught history of keeping deadly objects so close at hand, maybe we would need fewer prayers for those we have lost. If more thought was given to where guns belong and where they don't, maybe we would need to send fewer prayers to families who live with the consequences of guns ending up in the wrong hands. Thoughts and prayers are not a bad place to start, but both are meaningless unless they are followed by a willingness to learn from our history, to learn from our mistakes, to learn from our tragedies, and to act on the lessons that each has to offer. Thank you.